Welcome to Mr. Fright Nights, where nightmares come to life. If you love bone-chilling, immersive horror stories that feel real, stories that linger long after the last word, then you're in the right place. Before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Now, dim the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself. Tonight's horror begins now. I woke up choking on the stench of stale sweat and cold fear. My sheets were twisted around my ankles, and my heart thudded like I'd just sprinted a mile. My bedroom window faced east, and the weak light filtering in carried a peculiar stillness. That hush always got to me. It's as if dawn was holding its breath before unleashing the day's misery. My dog Toby stood by the door, tail rigid, ears flattened. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just stared, quietly insistent. Part of me hated that stare because it felt more like a warning than a plea to go outside. I pulled myself out of bed, stepping onto a squeaky floorboard in the hallway. The cold beneath my feet jolted me awake. There they were again, wet footprints crossing from the front door all the way down the hall to my bedroom. It was the third morning in a row I'd found these grimy trails. The first time I thought Toby had gotten up at night, so I started keeping him locked in my room to be sure. Yet the footprints continued to appear, each set more pronounced than the last. My mind cycled through easy explanations. Maybe the roof was leaking, maybe an intruder snuck in while I slept, or maybe I was messing with my own head. But the prints were so distinct, each toe splayed as if pressed by a living, breathing creature. Worse, they reeked like damp soil and sour decay. I crouched down and pressed my palm against one, feeling the clammy residue. Toby sniffed it once and let out a low rumble in his throat that made my skin crawl. I couldn't handle the smell any longer, so I staggered to the front door and yanked it open for fresh air. The lock was still bolted from the inside. I checked the windows. None were forced. The house was as locked as I'd left it before going to bed. Yet something, had marched through in the dead of night. Toby padded over, nudging my leg with his muzzle as though urging me to hurry up and do something. I turned to him, letting a bitter laugh escape. I get it, okay? You don't like this any more than I do? My voice sounded hollow in the vacant house. A chill slid through. Me, the kind that digs under your skin and festers. I forced a steady breath, mentally listing my next steps. Clean up the footprints, install more locks, maybe set up a camera. But I hesitated, terrified of what I might see if I actually captured the culprit on film. I grabbed an old mop from the closet, soaking its frayed end in a bucket of hot water mixed with disinfectant. As I swabbed away those footprints, my eyes welled up. Not with tears of sadness, but something rawer, a feeling that crunched my nerves from the inside. Toby kept close, occasionally pawing at the door that led to the basement. I never used the basement for much, just old furniture and dusty boxes. Not now, Toby, I murmured, scrubbing at a particularly dark footprint. It looked almost rust-colored in the morning light. We'll figure this out, I promise. But deep down, I suspected promises wouldn't mean much if I was already living with a threat far beyond my control. The fear inside me pulsed like a second heartbeat, matching Toby's unblinking vigilance. And something told me this was only the beginning. That same afternoon, I took Toby out for a short walk. He wouldn't settle otherwise. The crisp autumn air bit at my cheeks, and I tried ignoring the pang in my gut. Sleep had been elusive, and every time I closed my eyes, I pictured muddy footprints creeping up my hallway. Neighbors gave me polite nods, but I noticed a few anxious sidelong glances. Maybe they sensed my frazzled state, or maybe Toby's constant alertness put them on edge. For a moment, I considered telling them about the footprints, asking if they'd had break-ins or suspicious activity. But paranoia won out. I couldn't bear the thought of people labeling me as unhinged, I had enough trouble convincing myself I wasn't losing it. Back home, Toby led me straight to the basement door, pushing his nose against it. Usually he avoided the basement. His abrupt interest made me curious, so I flicked on the overhead light and let him guide me down the creaking stairs. The basement smelled like damp concrete and rotting cardboard. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, relics of my past and random junk from old garage sales. Toby sniffed around a cluster of boxes near the back, whining softly. I knelt beside him, rummaging through dusty contents, photo albums, broken picture frames, a few musty blankets. Then I found something wedged beneath an old trunk, a tattered shoe. The size suggested it belonged to a child. One shoelace was frayed, and the sole was caked with dried mud. "How did this end up here?" I muttered. I didn't recognize it from my childhood, and I'd never had kids. An uneasy tingle rippled across my scalp. Toby nuzzled my hand as if to say, "Keep going." So I dug deeper and spotted a metal canister behind the trunk. It rattled when I shook it. I pried it open, revealing a handful of black and white photographs. Most were water damaged and illegible, but one image showed a blurry figure in front of my house. It was an old photo, long before I ever moved here. The figure wore a ragged coat and stood barefoot on the porch. I couldn't make out a face, but the body language radiated desperation or rage. Something about it set my nerves on fire. My basement lights flickered, and Toby jerked back, yelping, once. Darkness swallowed the room for a full second, before the lights shuddered back to life. That was enough for me. I scooped up the canister and shoe, then hurried upstairs. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, the canister of photos on the coffee table. Toby paced with me, occasionally returning to sniff the basement door. My mind spiraled with possible scenarios: a previous owner with a traumatizing past, an unsolved break-in from decades ago. Or maybe these footprints had something to do with a child who disappeared long ago. I needed facts, not guesses, but dread threatened to paralyze me. Eventually, I fired up my laptop, intending to search the house's history. The real estate listing from when I bought it only mentioned it was built in the early 1900s. No mention of crimes or tragedies, but local archives might reveal something. I decided to check them the next day, in person. Online records aren't always thorough for older properties. Exhaustion tugged at me. I headed to bed early, gripping a flashlight under my pillow. Toby curled at my feet, ears twitching. Tonight, if muddy footprints reappeared, I intended to confront them, no matter how vicious or horrifying the source. Yet a quiet, treacherous part of me wished I'd never found that shoe in the basement. Because now, I couldn't pretend the footprints were just a random prank. I jolted upright in pitch darkness, heart hammering so loudly I thought my eardrums would burst. Toby stood at the bedroom doorway, his posture rigid. A single beam of moonlight sliced across the floor, illuminating fresh prints. They glistened, and something about their color made my stomach twist. They were red. I gripped my flashlight, flicked it on, and tiptoed out of bed. My pulse pounded in my temples. Toby advanced slowly, hackles raised, tail low. As we crept into the hallway, the prints smeared into a broader stain. It looked like watery blood trailing from the front door to the kitchen. A metallic tang permeated the air, so thick it caught in my throat. I flipped the hallway switch. The overhead light buzzed for a second before popping, plunging us back into near darkness except for my flashlight's narrow beam. Toby let out a low, menacing growl, a sound I'd never heard from him before. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. When we reached the kitchen, the sticky footprints led to the sink. I swung the beam across the counter and nearly dropped the flashlight. A butcher knife lay out, blade stained with streaks of crimson. Next to it, a small pool of blood. My mind reeled. Had someone broken in to harm me? Or was I the one who had done this in some fugue state? I thought about checking myself for injuries, but Toby kept pawing at the back door. That door was still locked, chain in place, no sign of forced entry. I pressed my ear against it, listening for movement on the other side. Silence. Whatever had happened, it left me holding a blood-smeared puzzle piece I had no idea how to solve. Enough, I muttered, trying not to panic. I'm calling the police. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. Yet a harsh realization hit me. Calling the cops would drag me into countless questions I couldn't answer. They'd ask about the footprints, the basement, the old photographs. They might suspect I'd harmed someone. My mind spun in a catastrophic loop. In the end, fear of the unknown was overshadowed by raw terror for my own safety. I dialed 911, explaining in short, breathless sentences that I woke up to find blood in my kitchen. I left out the footprints. The dispatcher said they'd send someone soon. I hung up, swallowing the bitter taste of dread. Toby stayed near me, trembling, occasionally lifting a paw and gazing at me like I was supposed to do something more. I'm trying, I rasped, tears prickling the corners of my eyes. The unstoppable feeling of being watched surrounded me, coiling around every breath. I couldn't ignore the possibility that, if I'd been asleep while someone roamed free in my house, what else could have happened without my knowledge? 10 minutes later, patrol lights flickered through the window, painting the walls in red and blue. Toby and I waited at the door as 2 officers entered, scanning the space, eyes narrowed. They asked the standard questions. Was I alone? Did I see an intruder? Had I touched anything? I pointed out the footprints and the knife, but they seemed skeptical. One officer ventured into the hall, checking each room. He found no broken windows, no sign of forced entry, no blood anywhere else. The prints had already begun to dry into crusted stains. They took a statement, but I could tell they weren't buying it. There was no victim, no visible injury on me, no logical explanation for how the footprints appeared with the house locked up. The officers gave me a perfunctory warning to stay safe, then left. The moment their car disappeared down the street, despair sank into my chest. Toby stared at me, unblinking. I forced a shaky smile. What now? Huh, boy? He let out a soft whimper that sounded almost like a response, and I realized I was trembling uncontrollably. That night, sleep never came. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, hugging Toby close, waiting for the sun to reveal new horrors. By morning, my eyes burned from exhaustion. Toby's presence was the only reason I stayed grounded enough to keep functioning. I threw on a jacket, pocketed the photograph canister, and drove downtown to the county archives. Maybe if I uncovered some hidden piece of the house's past, I could make sense of these footprints and the blood. The archives building was a crumbling structure that smelled of mothballs and old paper. Rows of filing cabinets and bookshelves crowded the main floor. I approached the front desk, where a tired-looking clerk peered at me over half-moon glasses. Do you have records on 23 Sycamore Lane? It's an old house from the early 1900s, I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. She nodded slowly, shuffling off to a labyrinth of shelves. I followed, Toby quietly at my side. The clerk gave me a stern look, but didn't protest Toby's presence after I explained he was a service dog. In truth, I just couldn't bear to leave him alone. After a few minutes of thumbing through dusty folders, she dropped a thick binder on the table. Inside were property deeds, newspaper clippings, and old census records. I started flipping pages, scanning for any mention of tragedy or crime. Most articles were routine: property tax disputes, new owners, renovations. Then a headline caught my eye: "Local boy missing. Last seen near Sycamore Lane." The date was 1954. Skimming the short article, I discovered the boy was never found. He'd been playing in front of a vacant house, my house, when a neighbor saw him vanish behind the porch. The neighbor claimed she heard muffled screams and ran to investigate, but the place was empty except for footprints that led inside. No suspects, no clues. Case went cold. A bitter taste filled my mouth as I recalled the child's shoe in my basement. I wondered if it belonged to that missing boy. Toby let out a short whine, pawing at my leg. Then another clipping, from 1978. Young woman disappears. Car found at 23 Sycamore Lane. A suspicious pattern emerged. Every couple of decades, someone vanished around that property. Always with footprints leading inside, and always unsolved. Toby sniffed the black and white photograph I'd brought, the one showing a ragged figure. My skin prickled as I realized the porch in the background was the same, but the article never mentioned an adult man or woman, just a child. So who was in the photo? I gathered copies, thanked the clerk, and hurried out. The air outside felt stale, like I'd stepped from one haunted place into another. My phone buzzed, a message from a blocked number. "Check your camera, Alma." I froze, mid-step. Camera? I hadn't installed the camera yet. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I rushed home, Toby barking urgently the moment we parked. The house looked the same from the outside, but anxiety coiled in my stomach. I edged inside, half expecting to find fresh footprints or worse. The silence was nearly suffocating. When I reached the living room, I saw it. A small USB camera perched on a side table, pointed at my hallway. It wasn't mine. There was a sticky note attached. Press play. My hands trembled as I popped the USB into my laptop. Toby snarled softly, as if protesting. Maybe I should have destroyed it. But I needed answers, or closure, or both. My chest tightened as I opened the file. The screen flickered, showing a grainy feed of my hallway at night. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m., the exact hour I'd woken to find blood-stained footprints. The image quality was poor, but enough to make out the shapes. A silent figure emerged from my bedroom, hair disheveled, movements stiff and unnatural. My flashlight's beam wavered as I realized I recognized that silhouette. It was me. In the video, I stumbled toward the front door, Toby trailing behind, barking in agitation. He lunged to block my path, but I shoved him aside with a force that made me recoil in real life. I'd never hurt Toby, not once. Yet there it was on screen. The camera's perspective shifted slightly, as if it had been moved. Then the figure on screen, myself, unbolted the door. A second shape stepped inside. Tall, wiry, features obscured by the camera's low resolution. The stranger grasped my arm, and I nodded, almost eagerly. The pair of us walked out of frame, Toby pacing anxiously, refusing to follow. Moments later, I re-entered the shot alone, carrying something wet in my hands. The screen's brightness was too low to see what it was clearly, but a dark fluid dripped from it. Then the figure on screen bent, pressing bare feet against the floor, leaving those crimson footprints as they shuffled back into the bedroom. The last thing I saw was Toby standing at a distance, hackles raised, obviously torn between loyalty and horror. My mind felt like it was splitting down the middle. Could I have been drugged, sleepwalking, or worse? None of it made sense, but the evidence was undeniable. The footprints, the blood, the missing shoe in the basement. Somehow I was in the center of it all. I slammed the laptop shut and nearly jumped out of my skin when Toby let out a sharp bark. I turned to find fresh footprints behind me, leading from the laptop desk back toward the basement door. These were faint, but glistening, as if newly formed. Fear ignited in me. My phone buzzed again. I'm waiting downstairs. My vision blurred. Everything felt inverted, like reality had twisted into a labyrinth. Toby bounded in front of me, blocking me from the basement door. But I had no choice. If there was a chance to confront whoever was behind this, I had to try. Terrified or not, my life was at stake. Grabbing the nearest object, A heavy flashlight. I inched toward the basement, flipping every switch I could. Light flickered pathetically against the old stone walls, casting jagged shadows. Toby's nails clicked against the steps behind me. Halfway down, the overhead bulb blew. Darkness swallowed the narrow stairwell. My breath caught, and I frantically fumbled for the flashlight switch. In that split second of darkness, I heard a ragged hiss from below, and Toby snarled in response. When light finally returned, I spotted a silhouette at the far end of the basement, a shape that vanished behind a stack of boxes. I raised the flashlight, voice trembling. "Who's there?" Toby barked, deep and furious, advancing ahead of me. No reply came, only a nerve-wracking silence. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I whipped around, shining the beam across empty space. There was nobody there. The basement felt like it was breathing around me. Hot, stale air pushing in from all sides. I swore under my breath, stepping deeper into the musty gloom. The footprints ended at a corner shrouded in shadow. My flashlight's circle settled on something small and pale on the concrete floor. A child's skeletal foot, severed at the ankle. My lungs seized. A phone rang. My phone, the tinny ring echoing in the cramped space. I picked up without thinking. A distorted voice whispered, "You let me in, Alma." My stomach lurched. The line went dead, and I stared at the phone, bile rising in my throat. Toby whined, pressing himself against my leg. Was I the intruder in my own home? I tore my gaze away from the severed foot on the floor, my soul recoiling from the horror of it. Toby pawed the ground, as if urging me to leave, but a dark curiosity anchored me there. A few feet away, near the trunk where I found the child's shoe, I noticed fresh smears of blood on the concrete. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. With trembling hands, I shifted one of the boxes. The stench hit like a hammer, sweet rot and copper. Beneath the box lay a plastic tarp, partially covering something lumpy. I inched the tarp aside, nearly retching at the sight of a decaying torso. The features were unrecognizable, but it was definitely human. A wave of revulsion slammed into me. Was this real? Was I hallucinating? I glanced at Toby. His ears were flattened, muzzle twitching, but he stayed close. My breath shook as I tried to piece together the twisted puzzle. The footprints, the child's shoe, old disappearances, that terrifying camera footage showing me in a daze. Could I have? No. It was impossible to believe I'd carried out such atrocities without any recollection. Yet the basement told a different story. A cold fear sank into my bones as I realized the dog had been trying to steer me away from this moment, staring at me each morning, whining at the door, pacing the halls. Toby must have sensed something was catastrophically wrong. I forced myself to check for any form of identification on the remains, but found none. Whoever this person was, they'd been dead for at least a few days. Maybe longer. My stomach lurched as my phone buzzed again. "You're close now. Keep going." Every nerve in my body shrieked for me to drop everything and call the cops. But how could I explain this nightmare? The footprints alone made me a suspect. The camera footage practically damned me. Still, I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone else was orchestrating it, controlling me, or worse, convincing me to doubt my own mind. Toby tugged on my pant leg, guiding me away from the corpse and toward a small closet under the stairs. The door was slightly ajar. I inched it open, shining my flashlight inside. Dust motes swirled, revealing a battered old desk with a single drawer. Inside the drawer, I found a stack of postcards, each bearing a single cryptic line. "He never left. They're still in the walls. You let them in." The final card made my heart stop. "This is your handwriting, Alma." I glanced at the cursive script, and it was identical to notes I'd scribbled for grocery lists or personal reminders. My hands shook so violently I dropped the card. Had I written these messages myself under some twisted compulsion? Or was someone forging my handwriting? Toby let out a sharp bark that echoed in the enclosed space, snapping me from my shock. "We have to get out," I whispered, unsure if I was talking to Toby or myself. I stuffed the postcards into my pocket, determined to piece this together above ground. We fled upstairs, slammed the basement door, and shoved a heavy dresser against it. My hands felt numb, a prickling sensation creeping over my skin. Toby paced near me, his anxious whines cutting straight into my ribs. I gave him a shaky pat. "Good boy," I mumbled, voice barely audible. Desperation fueled me. I hurried to the bathroom, flipping on the light. My reflection stared back. Hair tangled, eyes wide and bloodshot, face streaked with grime and possibly splashes of blood. I turned the faucet and splashed my face, trying to rinse away the horror. But in the mirror, my expression twisted into a grimace, almost a smirk. I recoiled, stepping back. The reflection flickered, just a trick of the overhead light. But my gut told me there was something more. Toby came in behind me, head lowered, gaze fixed on the mirror's reflection of me. Suddenly, he snarled, baring his teeth at my own image. I touched my chest, trying to slow my breathing. Each inhale felt like razor blades. That was when the memory fragments hit me. Fleeting, disjointed images. Darkness in the hallway. A tall figure. My own voice speaking calmly. "Yes, I'll help." The metallic scent of blood, and a child's faint cry echoing from some unseen corner. Then a blinding flash. I clenched the sink, nauseated. It was as though my brain had locked these memories away, only letting them leak out in stuttering bursts. I did something. Or I was forced to, I rasped, gagging at the thought. Toby whined, shoving his muzzle against my thigh, as if trying to snap me out of it. In a surge of self-loathing, I slapped the mirror with my palm, cracking it. Lines spread across the glass, fracturing my reflection into shards. Through those shards, I glimpsed Toby behind me, hackles raised. A phone rang, again that shrill tone cutting into my raw nerves. The phone lay on the bathroom counter, the screen lit with a blocked number. I snatched it, pressing it to my ear. "What do you want?" My voice cracked, a man's rasping whisper. "Come outside, or I keep the others." The line cut. Toby let out a strangled bark, turning to the hallway. My mind reeled. The others? Were there more victims? In my basement? Somewhere else in the house? I was out of time. If I wanted to save anyone, if there was anyone left to save, I had to confront whoever was behind this. I stomped to the front door, Toby close at my heel. My hand shook against the doorknob. "Stay," I commanded, voice trembling. Toby whimpered, but obeyed, eyes pleading. Then I wrenched the door open and stepped onto the porch. The early evening sky glowed a sickly orange. A lone figure stood on the sidewalk, a man wearing a tattered coat, barefoot despite the chill. My heart pounded as I recognized him from the old photograph. His hair was long and matted, face partially, hidden by shadow. When he spoke, I recognized that rasp, the voice from the phone. "You always let me in, Alma," he said, lips curling in a grin that made my insides revolt. "You do it every time." I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but my throat locked up. He lifted one mud-caked foot, as though showing off the reason for the footprints. My mind burned with questions. "Who are you? Why me?" He gestured toward the door. "Bring the dog. I have to show you what you've helped me accomplish." When I hesitated, he snapped, "Now." A feverish compulsion welled inside me. Before, I knew it. I was calling Toby. The dog padded out, clearly uneasy but unwilling to leave me alone. The man stepped closer, and an unbearable stench clung to him. Rotting leaves, rancid flesh. Toby growled, but the man just laughed. "I've been squatting in your mind for years," he crooned, leaning in so I could see the whites of his eyes, bloodshot and wild. "Each occupant of this house carries me forward. You're no different." He pressed a blood-streaked hand to my temple. A wave of dizziness hit me so fiercely I nearly collapsed. Images stormed through my head. I was a child, stumbling into this house, lured by a faint voice. I was older, handing that voice a key. I was covering a pit in the basement, ignoring the feeble cries from below. Toby lunged at the man, sinking his teeth into the filthy coat. The man snarled, and for a moment, I saw something unravel in his gaze. He stumbled back, letting out a gurgling shout. Toby held on, refusing to release, even as the man struck him across the muzzle. The smell of blood wafted up again, and I realized Toby had ripped into flesh. I used that moment of confusion to run inside, Toby at my side. I grabbed the phone, prepared to call 911 again. But the tall figure sprinted after us, pushing the door open with a crash. Toby bounded forward, determined to protect me. They wrestled violently near the hallway, toppling a side table. The lamp shattered, plunging the room into flickering darkness from a single overhead bulb. My mind screamed, "End this, now." I sprinted to the kitchen, grabbed the same butcher knife I'd found bloodied before. My pulse thundered as I whirled, seeing Toby pinned by the intruder's arm. Without giving myself time to question, I rammed the blade forward. It sank into the man's side with a sickening crunch. Warmth splattered against my hands. He let out a rattling gasp, staggering backward. Toby scrambled free, muzzle stained with blood. The man collapsed near the front door. His eyes locked on me, a venomous grin twisting his face. "You'll never be free of me. I am you." Those words drained the blood from my face. I lurched, pressing a hand against my temples. My brain felt like it was imploding, as if every memory I'd suppressed was clawing its way out. In a final convulsion, the intruder lay still. I dropped the knife, breath ragged, tears streaming. Toby nudged my leg, whining softly. I expected relief, but dread gnawed at me instead. Because if this was over, why did I still feel that presence creeping under my skin? Then my phone chimed, with a text from the same block number. "Check the camera." With trembling fingers, I hit play on the living room feed. The footage showed me standing alone, pantomiming a fight, stabbing empty air. Toby barked and danced around me, uncertain. There was no tall figure. There was no second man. Just me, soaked in blood. And behind me on the screen, the footprints appeared by themselves, forming out of nowhere before disappearing. My reflection in the blank TV screen flickered, wearing that same monstrous grin the intruder had. Toby cowered, backing away from me. I wanted to scream, but my voice refused to work. The final, crushing realization settled in. I brought these footprints to life. I was the one who spilled blood. I let them in, because they'd always been, inside me. Toby stared at me, ears pinned, trembling. He had been trying to warn me from the start, barking at the real monster. And the real monster was me.